Hello, I'm Do Coyle, and in this short presentation, I want to take a brief look at more recent developments in content and language integrated learning, or CLIL, as a pedagogic concept. We are living in times of rapid change, and CLIL has shifted from its earlier days of investigating potential learning gains, where subject learning or thematic studies and languages are successfully brought together, to now supporting a pluriliteracies approach where integrated learning in the broader sense can impact on any learning across any language. When the European Council for Modern Languages, the ECML, funded a trans-European team to work on pluriliteracies and CLIL in 2013, the early phase of working with Oliver Meyer, Anna Halbach, Theresa Ting and Kevin Schuck soon developed into what is now known as the Gratz Group, who are working with a new and evolving model for pluriliteracies in CLIL. I'd therefore like to share with other CLIL professionals how pluriliteracies, or the pluriliteracies approach, is rooted in the 4Cs framework, and therefore encourage teachers, teacher educators and researchers to conceptualize and reconceptualize their practices in the light of deepening understanding. So, I shall now explore this further. And I'd like to begin by revisiting the 4Cs framework. This framework was developed in the 1990s after working constantly with groups of teachers and teacher educators, especially my colleague Philip Hood at the University of Nottingham, and researchers across Europe, to provide a tool which foregrounded the fundamental elements of CLIL. It is now used widely across the globe to raise awareness of the components of CLIL and to support teachers in their CLIL planning. It highlights the need for teachers to not only focus on subject matter or content and language, but on the dynamic aspects of integrated learning, without which neither language progression nor knowledge construction can happen effectively. The 4Cs framework is based on the principle that strengthening and deepening a learner's conceptual understanding requires social, cultural, linguistic, and cognitive processes. The components of the 4Cs are content, cognition, communication, and culture. The first C, the C for content, is the subject or theme of learning, which ranges from subject disciplines such as science or geography to cross-disciplinary themes such as global citizenship or sustainability, which can be led by any teacher. It is important to note that content in the broadest sense may range from topics and themes which language teachers may wish to work with in their classes, to those which subject teachers must cover as part of their syllabuses. Content can be worked on at any age and stage. Critically, content learning involves meeting and understanding new knowledge, including concepts, facts, and procedures, so that learners can apply their knowledge to problem-solving, discussion, or further developments. The second C, for cognition, requires learners to process information and engage with it in order to make meaning. Constructing meaning involves individual learners in applying and strategically using existing and new knowledge to solve problems and carry out tasks related to the subject or theme. It also involves learners in cognitive challenge through higher order thinking, for example, as set out in Bloom's taxonomy. We know that content is not about rote learning of facts, but that it is all about how learners can engage in different creative and challenging ways so that their learning can be internalized. The third C is communication, and perhaps one which is the most interesting. It focuses on the language which is needed to construct knowledge. It cements content and cognition, since language is needed by individuals to share and demonstrate understanding, both externally and internally. Communication involves both language learning, that is, acquiring the language needed to learn the subject or theme, and language using, that is, using language to articulate understanding and thereby engage in the learning process. Communication is part of any learning, be it through a foreign, first, second, third language, and so on. The language triptych provides us with a useful reminder that creating the necessary context for learning needs to enable learners to access the language of learning, language for learning, and language through learning. Let's think. Language of learning is the language closely related to the content, such as key vocabulary, expressions, and terminology. Language for learning is the language learners need to process and operationalise their understanding in the classroom, such as how to work in a group or write a report. And language through learning is the language that emerges and is needed by individual learners to deepen and internalise their learning. In other words, new learning requires new language determined by the learner, not the teacher. The fourth C, culture, has two interrelated strands. First, at the macro level, culture encompasses making transparent societal values and cultures embedded in home and other contexts. Culture is the filter through which individuals interpret their world. CLIL requires learners to develop intercultural understanding, which impacts on all the other Cs. Second, at the micro level, in CLIL, each subject discipline or related theme has its own culture, with its own content, ways of communicating and interpreting the world. These subject-specific norms impact on the way in which content is conceptualised and the kind of discourse functions used to support related learning processes. It requires learners to think and act like a scientist or like a geographer or like a global citizen. So, the 4Cs framework is therefore a conceptual framework which is a useful aide-memoire in planning and conceptualising CLIL programmes for learning to be successful and connected in CLIL classrooms. It provides a useful tool and springboard. So, what about integrated learning beyond the 4Cs? The acronym CLIL emphasises the integration of content and language learning. As I've said, the 4Cs framework was developed to draw attention to elements of learning which go beyond content and language. When learning takes place through another language, the integration of these elements is critical for deep learning to occur. Whilst the 4Cs framework enables us to conceptualise CLIL holistically, it does not inform us about the how of integrated learning over time. The Gratz Group has been working with colleagues in the field to develop a new understanding of the interconnectedness of the elements of CLIL, to provide guidance about how integrated learning can lead to progression over time as played out in the classroom. I shall start with an obvious statement. Content only becomes meaningful when it is understood, that is, conceptualised. Conceptualisation requires language to be used appropriately, since it is through language that understanding is made visible. So, what do we mean by making learning visible? This happens when learners put into their own words what they have learnt. This articulation, or to use Swain's term, languaging, requires not just any language, but language which relates to the subject cultures and disciplines. However, when concepts are linked to specific subject tasks and activities, this languaging, or explaining learning, requires language which is specific to the cognitive discourse functions of the subject discipline. For example, classifying, explaining, describing, justifying, in order to make thinking visible. Each discourse function takes on a different shape depending on the context and subject discipline. In order to progress, learners have to learn how to adapt these discourse functions to different subject cultures. Learning progression, then, is about individuals becoming increasingly skilled in purposeful communication across cultures and languages, using the appropriate style, mode, and genre typical of their subject and their audience. So this implies that they will have to develop subject literacies across languages. And by that, we mean pluriliteracies. Therefore, meaning-making, which involves knowing, that's the content, and thinking, or the cognition, only becomes visible when what is learnt is articulated, that is, through communication. Throughout schooling, this communication needs to become increasingly interculturally aware and subject appropriate. In other words, we cannot separate one C from another. So, what is the pathway from subject literacies to pluriliteracies? Subject literacies have to be developed throughout schooling across disciplines and languages. Whilst this may appear a given it does not automatically happen, since the development of learners' subject literacies is not usually prioritised either by subject teachers or by language teachers. Fundamentally, it requires learning to be conceptualised as progression along the knowledge pathway, in order to increase learners' meaning-making potential and lead them further into deeper learning of subject disciplines. Starting with basic literacies in any language, learners move increasingly towards subject-specific literacies, broadening the range of text types through which they express their knowledge and understanding. In order to do this, learners must become familiar with a range of genres. They have to learn how to communicate their understanding at deeper levels in different styles and for different purposes. This in turn requires the use of appropriate subject-specific modes, such as spoken and written text, visual and graphic representations. It is using these principles that our Pluriliteracies model is based. The model takes individual components related to the 4Cs framework and demonstrates how an integrated approach requires a shift in how we conceptualize learning in CLIL classrooms. It focuses on the development of subject literacies. It draws on integrating conceptual development and linguistic progression through a range of social, linguistic, communication and cultural processes discussed previously. Our model therefore eliminates the content-language divide. Placing Pluriliteracies development at the centre of learning challenges teachers to focus on subject-specific task performance if learners are to actively engage in subject-specific discourses. Anna Halbach, a member of the Gratz group, has created a YouTube video where she explains in greater detail the Pluriliteracies model, so do take a look. Finally, I would like to underline the fundamental need for learner progression in CLIL to become much more transparent. So, the Pluriliteracies model focuses on meaning making. Learner progression happens through strengthening the connections between two continua: the conceptualizing continuum and the communication continuum. As a subcategory along the communication continuum, mode stresses the need for teachers to enable their learners to understand, critically reflect upon, and to create multimodal messages, essential for operating successfully in current contexts. Novices move outwards through the pluriliteracy arc in the model. Pluriliterate experts are sensitive to the social and cultural context and can position themselves inside the two axes of the continua. This involves learners in responding appropriately to the demands of a given task. In essence, it requires them to adapt their language to specific purpose, modes, and audiences in order to communicate their understanding and construct meaningful social interactions. The Pluriliteracies model provides a means of visually mapping progression in literacies over time across languages, subjects, and contexts. The model fundamentally challenges the relation between content and language, which has dominated CLIL discussions during the last 2 decades. In simple terms, by working on the language, learners refine their understanding, and by increasing their understanding, they also become able to express their knowledge in more appropriate and more sophisticated terms. Language and content therefore determine each other. The model suggests that defining levels of subject literacies may become possible. This will fundamentally change the ways in which learning is assessed in CLIL contexts in the future. The model also bridges learning across languages by integrating learning and transfer through a foreign or second language with mother tongue learning. Hence, all learning, whatever the language, can benefit from this approach. The Gratz group hopes that the Pluriliteracies model provides a transparent pathway for progression where language and language awareness can, and profitably ought to be developed into a whole school approach to learning, cutting across languages and subject boundaries and promoting pluriliterate citizens. We're looking forward to collecting case studies of teachers who are working with the model. What we do know is that for CLIL to be sustainable and successful, then it has to develop further, and we hope that the Pluriliteracies model provides a useful trigger for discussion. We really welcome that. Thank you.